Okay, and we are live. Welcome, everyone. It's such a pleasure to have you here with us. My name is Ali Menegakis, and I am the founder of South Carolina for Criminal Justice Reform. I'm joined today by my illustrious co-host, Tola Familoni, who's also on the executive board for South Carolina for Criminal Justice Reform. And we are so honored to have a very special guest with us, Professor Dr. Alex Vitale, who is from Brooklyn College, and I'm going to be introducing him shortly. But before I do, let me, as I always do, just tell you all about South Carolina for Criminal Justice Reform. We were founded in January of this past year. We are a 100% grassroots, nonpartisan organization. We're dedicated to holistic criminal justice reform in South Carolina. Our team is composed of criminal justice reform advocates from diverse backgrounds, including criminal defense attorneys, public defenders, former prosecutors, academics, formerly incarcerated individuals, and others who are passionate about criminal justice reform in our state. Our motto is fairness, awareness, and change, and we are dedicated to unveiling the injustices throughout each stage of the criminal justice system, educating the public on these injustices, researching, interviewing experts as we are today on possible solutions, and ultimately coming up with creative proposals and pushing for legislative reform in our state. With the recent death of George Floyd, our organization has focused on police policies and problems in law enforcement agencies, and we are now offering a virtual series, which this is episode 2 of it, called Dissecting Police Problems and Solutions. Our first episode of that, we hosted a few professors, including Professor Seth Stoughton out of the University of South Carolina, where we focused on qualified immunity and use of force. And today we are so honored to be joined by Dr. Alex Vitale. Dr. Vitale is a professor of sociology and coordinator of the Policing and Social Justice Project at Brooklyn College, and also a visiting professor at London South Bank. He has spent the last 25 years meticulously researching and writing about policing. He consults with police departments and human rights groups worldwide. He offers his expertise and advice on how to effectively and justly police. Professor Vitale has authored multiple books, including The End of Policing and City of Disorder, How the Quality of Life Campaign Transformed New York Politics. His research has appeared in Policing and Society, Police Practice and Research, Mobilization, Contemporary Sociology. He has appeared recently on CNN, The Daily Show, to discuss the concept of defunding the police and what police reform would look like in our country. He's a frequent essayist whose writings have appeared in the New York Times, New York Daily News, The Nation, Vice News, Jacobin, and USA Today. And I could go on for more time than we have today talking about his accolades. But Professor Dr. Vitale, we are so honored to have you here. Thank you for joining us. We know you're a busy man these days.
No problem. You're most welcome, Ali. Thanks so much for the invitation. I think it's so important to support the work that's happening on the ground in communities all across the country, and that has been going on long before the horrible events we've seen in the last few weeks in Minneapolis, Atlanta, Los Angeles, etc. So let's try to think together a little bit about the problem we're facing and some avenues that might productively lead to the kind of changes I think people want to see. So what's happening in Washington is not good. It's not helping. The bills that are under consideration by both the Republicans and the Democrats, I think, are wholly inadequate to the task, and the executive order signed by the president is no better, and arguably no worse than those other bills. Unfortunately, the discourse in Washington continues to center around a set of mostly procedural reforms to policing. Some are a little bit tighter and more mandatory. Some are a little bit more advisory and suggestive, but they all imagine that the problems of policing can be fixed through a project of professionalization and enhanced accountability. And my argument is that this really misunderstands the nature of the problem. And we can see this pretty clearly when we look at the events in Minneapolis. Minneapolis really took the lead of the Obama administration, which after the events in Ferguson, convened a panel of experts that developed a program for fixing policing, the Task Force on 21st Century Policing. And it contained a whole long list of reforms, again, designed to make police more professional, to restore trust between police and the public. These included things like implicit bias training, which is included in the current Democratic bill. This is a deeply inadequate approach to the problem. It imagines that the problems of racism in policing are completely accidental, unintentional, and have to do with the decisions of a few individual officers. So first of all, this ignores the fact that we have a problem of explicit racism in American policing. When we look for racism in American policing, we find it in the chat rooms and the Facebook pages and the email threads, and frankly, the official statements of many police union leaders across the country. Their defense of openly racist behavior by their members, their defense of deeply racially problematic practices show us just how big the problem of entrenched explicit racism is. Just recently in San Francisco, an implicit bias trainer resigned because he said the culture of the policing in San Francisco was so intensely racist that this training had become completely irrelevant and pointless. But even if there wasn't racism on the part of individual officers, and we have a much more diverse police force in the United States than we had even 20 years ago. And we have many African Americans in leadership positions in American policing. So this system doesn't require the explicit personal racism of officers. It rests on a form of structural racism. And what I mean by that is actually not the decisions made by police as much as the decisions made by politicians. When our politicians confront a whole set of social problems that they have helped create through their economic programs, and then turn those problems over to the police to manage, they are reproducing racial inequality in the United States. Because the decision to use policing to manage community problems places a whole set of additional burdens on those communities and does nothing to address the underlying social, political, and cultural dynamics that have created those problems in the first place. This is kind of the problem with community policing initiatives as well. Imagining that if the community and the police can just get together, discuss the problems of racism and all take a knee together, that this will solve the problem. Or the idea that if the community could just bring all its problems to the police and work with the police in developing strategies to solve those problems, that this would improve police-community relations and the effectiveness of policing. But the problem is that this rests on the idea that police are the most appropriate agency for solving these community problems. But what tools do the police have to solve our community problems? Guns, handcuffs, ticket books, threats. These are not the tools that we need to solve our community problems. They don't have access to affordable housing. They don't have access for youth jobs. They don't have access to high quality mental health care services, to high quality medically based drug treatment services. These are the kinds of things that are going to actually make communities stronger, healthier, more resilient, and safer. So why do politicians in both parties at the local, state, and national level continue to think we can fix policing by giving them more training, having more community policing, even throwing a couple of officers in prison? They do that because they don't want to address the fundamental social problems that they've given rise to, because in part, they misunderstand the fundamental nature of policing and its role in that process. They imagine that the neutral, professional implementation of the law by police automatically benefits everyone in society. But this just isn't true. There's a famous 19th century saying that the law in its majesty forbids both the rich and the poor from sleeping under bridges, stealing bread, and begging in the streets. But of course, the rich don't need to do these things. Those laws fall exclusively on the already most vulnerable members of our community. We can see this most clearly today with the drug laws. We've been waging a war on drugs for over 50 years now, and drugs are cheaper, easier to get, and of higher quality than they've ever been. We have opioid overdoses through the roof. We have widespread problems with methamphetamine use and other drugs. And policing has only accomplished the sad reality of putting millions of people in prison for drugs, and no lives have been saved. No one has been prevented from getting access to drugs. The completely professional, neutral, unbiased enforcement of the drug laws is going to ruin some young person's life for no good reason. There's no justice in it. We don't need to give narcotics units anti-bias training to address the fundamental injustices of the drug war. We need to end the drug war. The drug war, especially at the federal level, was created by the Nixon administration initially to serve a political purpose. In the wake of the civil rights movement, he was looking for a way to both punish his political enemies, young white radicals and African Americans, and also in the process of demonizing them to appeal to historically democratic white voters in the South, to say to them that the Republican Party is going to be the new home of racism in the United States in the wake of Democratic support for civil rights legislation during the Johnson administration. We know this because members of the Nixon White House, some of his senior advisors, have come public and have said they were in these meetings when this was about punishing enemies and a rancid politics of race. It had nothing to do with public health, nothing to do with public safety. It didn't even have anything to do with drugs. They chose drugs because they thought they could make an argument for why the federal government should get involved. And that was that many drugs cross international and state boundaries. We don't need more neutral professional enforcement of laws that don't benefit everyone equally. And whenever we see a problem turned over to the police to manage, we should be asking ourselves, what is the political project? What are the political interests that are being served by that decision? Instead of criminalizing our problems, we should be looking to solve them in concrete, positive ways. Part of the reason we have to do this, when we have to rethink our over-reliance on policing, is that policing has always been a tool to enable political projects that enable regimes of economic exploitation. And we can see this clearly in the origins of policing in the United States. The first state police force formed in the United States was the Pennsylvania State Police, formed in 1902, because they couldn't get local police forces to suppress workers' movements in the Pennsylvania coal fields and iron factories. So they brought in a new force that would be capable of suppressing these movements. And the model for that new police force was the US occupation of the Philippines. They actually brought individuals and new technology directly from that colonial occupation to Pennsylvania to suppress those movements. Workers in Pennsylvania called that new police force the Pennsylvania Cossacks because it was a tool to repress their movements. We had colonial policing in the United States as well. Groups like the Texas Rangers and other Western police forces were formed to help facilitate the extermination of indigenous populations and the pushing out of historically Spanish and Mexican landholders to make way for white settlement. But I argue that the earliest police force in the United States that fits the typical academic definition of being professional, uniformed, 24-hour law enforcement oriented police was actually the Charleston City Watch and Guard. In doing the research for this book, I actually visited Charleston and went through some archives and visited some of the historic homes that kept slaves and learned that in Charleston, like many
I'm sorry, Professor, to interrupt you. I think we cut off, I think we got a little internet problem when you were right before you talked about Charleston. If you could just
okay, let's try again.
Thank you.
Let's try again. Okay, so in doing research for this book, I actually visited Charleston. I looked through some archives. I visited some homes in which slaves were kept. And I learned from that and other readings that in many of the big cities of the South, like Savannah and New Orleans and Charleston, that slaves worked outside the homes of their owners in the newly industrializing Southern economy. They worked unloading ships. They worked on wharves. They worked in warehouses and small-scale manufacturing as well. And so the folks during this period in Charleston, whites are a minority of the population. And blacks are not contained in individual properties. They are moving about the city. And the Charleston City Watch and Guard is created to manage that mobile slave population. But the law that they were enforcing was primarily the laws of slavery. So it was a modern police force, but its primary mission was the micromanagement of the behavior of slaves to prevent the formation of reading groups, underground societies, and most importantly, to prevent slave uprisings against the minority white slave-owning population. So today, we don't have slavery or colonialism in these forms. We barely have industrialization as we saw in the northern cities. What we have is a system of kind of neoliberal austerity politics. Government at all levels is using its resources to push wealth up the economic ladder to the already most successful parts of the economy in hopes that some of that wealth will magically trickle down to the rest of us. But we haven't seen much trickle down. What we've seen is the rise of mass homelessness, mass untreated mental illness, mass untreated substance abuse problems, mass economic precarity that's driven people into the black markets of drugs and sex work and stolen property. And police have been turned loose on those problems to manage them, to keep a lid on them, so that that system of economic inequality can keep moving right along. So that when we're told we can fix the problems of policing with de-escalation training or throwing a few cops in jail, we paper over this larger reality that policing is being used to facilitate ongoing racialized exploitation. It is allowing that system to move forward. And any politician who takes a pro-policing stance is complicit in that reality. And this is really the political problem we're up against, is that our political leaders in both political parties remain invested in a politics of making deals with those folks who are already rich and powerful. They want to make their downtown real estate deals. They want to subsidize some new corporate headquarters. And they get huge campaign contributions to do exactly that. And so one of the things we need to do is we need to have greater awareness of the position of these politicians in relationship to policing. One way to do that is to look at the contributions of police unions. Police unions have been giving away huge amounts of money to reinforce the idea that they are the appropriate tool for solving our community problems. And they often work in sync with elite interests who share that view because they benefit from it. And it's my opinion that any politician who takes money from police unions cannot be our friend, because they are not only diverting resources from the kinds of services that our communities need, they're also enabling an ideology and an institution that's working against our interests, that says that our communities don't need housing and better schools and better jobs. They need more police, and they need more people to be put in prison. And this is an ideology that is antithetical to building up communities and creating more justice in our society. So this defund the police movement is not just a movement to cut the police budget. It's a movement to enhance public safety, to create more justice, to create more economic opportunity. And it's led by people who have experienced a lack of safety, who have been victims of violence and deprivation, and for whom police have not been an adequate source of safety. We know that in so many communities across the country, people don't call the police, even when they're experiencing violence and threats to their safety, because they believe that police will make their lives worse, not better. Because police are violence workers. That's what distinguishes them from any other part of government. And people don't want that violence in their lives. And they don't want that history of racial animus in their lives. So they are demanding better solutions to their problems. Community-based domestic violence strategies, community-based youth violence strategies, putting counselors and social workers back in our schools, creating adequate community-based mental health services, doing something about chronic homelessness, and addressing problems of drugs and sex work in ways that give people avenues out of those lives rather than trying to criminalize them. So that's what's going on across the country. These movements are about going to budget hearings, lobbying city council members, writing letters to the editor, and yes, getting out in the streets and protesting. It's about identifying specific things that police are doing and the dollar amounts that are being spent to support that, and shifting it into community identified alternatives. What needs to happen across the country is a new process where city leaders consult with local communities about their specific community safety needs and work with them to develop targeted specific interventions to more effectively address those needs. And to pay for that, we need to divert funding from policing and courts and jails and prisons to make that possible. And that's exactly what's going on in Minneapolis, or at least what's been proposed, is a period of community consultation, of developing new community-based resources and shrinking the footprint of policing. People worry, well, what will I do in a crisis? Well, there's no magic switch where tomorrow, poof, there's no police. There's no city council in the country that's going to zero out the police budget this year. This is about a process of incrementally developing alternatives, engaging in prevention strategies, of reducing the threats to our safety while we dial back policing. And as we develop new strategies, we continue this process. So I enlist you all to join in this movement of holding political leaders accountable and pressuring for a real vision of justice and safety for our communities that doesn't rely on people with guns. So I'll stop there and I'll be happy to take any questions.
So I think we have one from Facebook that I guess I'll start off with. It's, what about the concern that in the past, Black and other poor communities were often under-policed, living with the knowledge that crimes against them would not be pursued? This person's also wondering about data that suggests more police on the streets might help reduce crime against community members.
Okay, so two things here. One is that it is true that police have underserved those communities, but this is not an accident. Policing was never created to serve those communities. It was created to micromanage those communities, to allow systems that exploited them to continue. So they're only concerned about the problems of those communities in the degree to which they threaten those systems of economic exploitation. And what this movement is demanding is not fewer resources to keep people safe. They're demanding more resources to keep people safe, to address exactly the failures of that system to keep people safe. And it's led by people from these communities who have experienced this profound unsafety. Remind me the second part of the question? Oh, yes. So what about the data that has emerged very recently that shows that if we flood a community with more police, we'll see some reduction in crime? So for decades, we've had very consistent data that shows that this actually is not true, that changing the amount or nature of policing has almost nothing to do with crime rates. Recently, a few economists who have never met a police officer and have never been in the communities that experience high crime have done some fancy correlation studies and found in a few specific situations that if you flood a particular neighborhood with police, that you might get some crime reduction in one type of crime here, one type of crime over there, but not overall. And those crime reductions are not very large. A 10% reduction in burglaries or a 15% reduction in robberies, but no reduction in domestic violence, no reduction in homicides, no reduction in petty larcenies. But also what's left out of these studies consistently is any accounting for the cost of flooding a community with police. What is the cost? Not just the financial cost, which is substantial. It's the loss of money that could be spent in other ways, but also the impact of that policing on the lives of those policed. We know, for instance, that just the involvement of police in the lives of people can produce negative health outcomes for them. African American men in particular have been, it's well documented that subjecting them to vehicle stops, stop and frisks, police harassment, police questioning is such an intense form of stress in their lives that it directly contributes to specific negative health outcomes for them. And when we criminalize people, we drive them into the criminal justice system, we often ruin their lives. And this is a cost too. Even if that person had committed some harm in the community, to force them into permanent unemployment, put them in a system where violence is the norm, where eventually they're going to come out and be unemployable, angry, and a source potentially of more problems for the community. That is a cost too that should be part of this calculation, but never is. Better that we actually look at evidence-based strategies of reducing violence and crime that don't rely on those harmful approaches.
Dr. Vitale, it's so interesting you mentioned that. I mean, I am not aware of that specific economic study, but I would also be curious to see, well, if there is such a, reduction in, let's say, burglaries or maybe even like drug possessions or sales, what is the impact on the surrounding communities? Did those go up where they just moved to another location? I mean, I don't know if it studied that, but that's just something I was.
It depends on the type of crime. So sometimes if you flood an area with police, you get a reduction in certain kinds of street crime in that area. But with something like drugs, it never, or sex work, it never has any effect, right? Because people will just move around. The trade goes indoors. People just have to walk a couple of blocks the other direction. I've worked with police for decades, and very few of them think that they're doing anything to deny people access to drugs. Peter Moskos, who was a police officer in Baltimore, wrote a book called Cop in the Hood. And he said nothing we ever did made any difference on the drug crime. Whether it was chasing dealers off a corner or doing a month-long investigation with the FBI where they would come in and arrest 100 people, he said nobody went 5 minutes without access to whatever kind of drugs they wanted. Just a total 100% failure. We should look at what other places are doing. Places like Portugal that have decriminalized all drugs and turned the problem over to public health authorities. Drug use did not increase. Overdoses have fallen significantly. HIV transmission rates have fallen, and civilization did not collapse. They're very happy with the outcome. And we need to start demanding strategies like that here.
Professor, Tola and I was a former public defender. Tola is a public defender. And, in that role, you see a lot of cases. We have huge caseloads. And one thing that I noticed in the past several years is an increase, and there's been talk about that now again, about an increase in community policing. I know you speak about this in your book, and I found that so interesting. I know personally for me, when I first started hearing about community policing, I saw it in the probable cause affidavits for my clients. So many times I saw criminal cases that started with contact, and the first sentence was always, I was out on patrol doing community policing. And then what happens? An arrest happens. And in my opinion, seeing that, it's like, how is this helping? I know you speak a lot about that in your book. Can you talk briefly about your opinion on how that could help or not help?
So if we look at this issue historically, we see very quickly that community policing is always something that's trotted out after there has been abusive policing uncovered. It's a public relations strategy to try to win back trust in the police department so that they can go back to criminalizing people. The community in community policing, this has been well studied in a number of cities, is never representative of the community. The kind of people who are in dialogue with the police are folks who share a police outlook. They tend to be the landlords and the business owners and a few church leaders and others who want the police to do more. There are no homeless people in these meetings. There are no youth in these meetings. There are no undocumented people in these meetings. There are no people who have had drug and mental health problems in these meetings. So it's not representative of the community. But also, as I mentioned before, it's really just about expanding policing. It's about increasing our reliance on policing at the expense of anything else. And mostly it's just superficial. Everything now is community policing. In New York, we had community policing once before, and it was such a failure that under pressure to do something, they brought it back now as neighborhood policing. And we were told, oh, they're going to do problem solving, right? But what happens when we have police solve problems? They make arrests, they harass people. So I said to the police department, I had meetings with the top brass, and I said, could you give me some examples of how these neighborhood officers are solving problems using non-traditional law enforcement methods? Well, it's been 2.5 years and I'm still waiting for an example.
So is the ultimate goal the abolition of police? Is that the argument in terms of changing the way we operate in terms of social norms with the legalization of sex workers, drugs? Is it just getting rid of the institution completely, or is it trying to find a balance between what's currently going on now and the hope that communities are taking care of themselves? What's the goal here?
Well, there are a lot of people in this movement who want to see no police. But they understand that this is about trying to figure out a future possibility, right? Because a world without police requires a world without exploitation. And we got a long way to go till we get to anything like that. But they aspire to a world where safety is not produced by people with guns and putting people in cages. And I would like to live in a world like that too. I'm not sure what that world would look like. I'm not sure how to get there. What I do have clarity about is that it's not going to happen by putting more money in police budgets. It's going to happen by taking money out of police budgets, of limiting the scope and intensity of their activities and replacing it with things that produce real safety and real justice in our communities. So, yes, there are people who have these aspirations, and I share many of these aspirations, but there's nobody out there who's saying tomorrow we're just going to have no police and then we'll figure it out. That's not what anybody who's actually doing this work on the ground is talking about.
Professor, when we talk about, how traditionally more money has been put into the police departments, you naturally get to the point of, the resources that the police have, and that includes, discussions of militarization of police and the weapons that they use. Here in Charleston, as in most of the country and in the world in parts, we have seen a significant protesting, and we have seen response from local police agencies, which many people have said, I didn't know that, this police agency had tanks. I didn't know that this police agency had all these, non-lethal weapons, such as, tear gas related projectile bullets, things of that nature. Can you touch on that and how that affects, specifically in today's climate with the movements and protesting?
Well, certainly, to start with, we should not call these non-lethal, even in quotes. We should call them less lethal. We've had at least one fatality as a direct result of the use of tear gas during these protests. So, and there have been other cases historically of people killed by rubber projectiles, tear gas, etc. So these are dangerous tools, and we should be clear about that. In terms of the overall militarization of policing, this again represents a political failure, a political project of turning problems over to the police to manage. As more things have been turned over to the police, there has been resistance. And that resistance has been met through an intensification of policing. And it's not just about the hardware, which of course is in and of itself a problem. It's also about a discourse from political leaders that tells police that they're waging a war on crime and a war on drugs and a war on terror and a war on gangs and a war on disorder, which is really a war on the poor. And so even if we get rid of some of the hardware, but we maintain this mission of policing, as being at war with large segments of the population, there's going to be abuse. And it's going to fall disproportionately on communities of color, because they are the ones whose problems have been turned. They have the most problems because of their economic position. And then they've been told that the only tools they can have to meet their problems is more policing. So we need to definitely, get rid of the federal programs that pay for these weapons or transfer them from the Defense Department. But really, we have to address the political discourse that the police are at war with the public.
We have a question from somebody's viewing. Do you have any recommendations of actions young people can take to further this movement?
Well, you can start by talking to your parents. I've spoken in a lot of high schools, and there are a lot of young people who share these ideas, and their parents don't. Their parents want more police. Their parents have accepted that the only choice they have is to turn these problems over to police. So let's start there. I think the other concrete thing they can do is to get police out of their schools and start demanding the kinds of resources that they think will make their schools safer. We have flooded American schools with policing. In New York City, we have 5,000 NYPD personnel in New York City schools, which is more than all counselors and social workers combined. And this is just a totally failed set of political priorities. And fortunately, one of the outcomes of this movement is more and more cities rethinking their reliance on school policing. So I think young people need to organize within their schools to demand more counselors, more high quality after school programs, more mentors, getting rid of zero tolerance disciplinary systems, involving young people directly in discipline procedures through restorative justice programs that treat kids with dignity and respect and involve them in the production of safe school environments.
Now, what about the argument that police have a relatively strong impact on violent crime? Do you believe that the reduction of funds or the reduction of presence will have a negative impact, i.e. the increase of violent crime in our communities?
Well, we don't really have data that shows that. I mean, there are one or two studies that show, a minor improvement on a few measures, but we don't really have data that shows that. Now, obviously, if tomorrow there were just no police, there would be problems. But no one's calling for that. This question doesn't understand what this movement is asking for. They're not asking for that. So I'm not worried about that at all, because that's not what anyone is proposing. What we're proposing is putting into neighborhoods all kinds of evidence-driven anti-violence programs that will make communities safer than they are today. That's what this movement is calling for.
And what would you say to those who believe that the way police are acting now is completely appropriate? They feel safer, they are comfortable with what's going on. They believe that let's use our current climate, the current responses to protesters and those who are acting in ways that seem to push back against our social norms are being disciplined correctly.
Well, I think that is an authoritarian politics that rests on a foundation of racism. Because it says that the only thing those people will understand is the whip or the chains. And that's been the history of American policing, is telling those people how to behave through violence, threats, and coercion. And this movement is demanding that people stop being treated that way. And we have plenty of evidence to show that there are ways of addressing this. Let's talk about youth violence for a second. So one of the things we know about young people who commit violence is that almost every single one of them has been the victim of violence previously in their homes, in their communities, and no one has ever done anything to address that trauma, to try to break that cycle of violence, because that's what it is. It's a cycle of violence, and it's been going on for generations. And the only response we get to that cycle of violence from government is putting people in jails and prisons and subjecting them to police violence on the streets. How does that break the cycle of violence? How does that help heal people? How does that help people find new ways of dealing with the pain and suffering that they're living with? It doesn't. It just drives them into institutions where violence is more common, is normative, is necessary to survive. And then when they come out and commit additional acts of violence, we're like, oh my God, like it's a surprising outcome. How could the outcome be any different, really? So we have to completely rethink this idea that justice and safety are produced through intimidation, punishment, and more violence. That doesn't sound like justice to me. That sounds like retribution. And I don't remember anything on the sermon from the Sermon on the Mount about retribution. I remember a lot of talk about justice, loving, and forgiveness. And we need to try to integrate those ideas into how we address these issues.
I think that segues nicely into this next question about the implementation of drug courts and mental health courts as diversionary programs. What are your thoughts on those institutions?
So those institutions suffer from the same problem that a lot of these police reforms suffer from, which is we turn problems over to the criminal justice system to manage, and then when we're unhappy with how they do it, we try to tinker with it to round off the edges to make it seem that it's more helpful and friendly. But the research shows that these specialized courts are not particularly successful and hugely expensive. And we have this deeply ironic, unjust situation where we have high quality medical drug treatment on demand nowhere in the United States. But then when people get caught up in the criminal justice system, they get forced treatment with the threat of future incarceration if they don't follow through. At the very least, shouldn't we have voluntary drug treatment available to people before we criminalize them, before we threaten and coerce them? That just seems like a no-brainer, right? Then, if there are people who are causing harms to the community, even when we make services available to them, then we can talk about the strategies to address that. But let's start with actually making drug treatment available for people when they want it, where they need it.
Professor, in your book, The End of Policing, you discuss how police have evolved to a point where our government has placed so many responsibilities on them that they're ill-equipped to handle all of those things. Can you touch on what you mean when you say that?
Well, right. As we turn every problem under the sun over to them to manage, they're supposed to be, mentors to youth, mental health emergency responders, substance abuse experts, youth violence workers, traffic enforcement specialists. They can't do all these things. I mean, even when we give them more training, first of all, the research shows it doesn't really help. And second, the trainings are contradictory. So in one situation, you're supposed to use, command presence, forcefully ordering people around to control a situation. But in another situation, you're supposed to be calm and passive and, talk in a friendly tone. Like, how is an officer supposed to know which set of trainings they're supposed to use in each different situation? You know, many of them make a heroic effort to do this, and some are more successful than others, but you know, it leads to a lot of really bad outcomes, and we have clear evidence to support alternative ways of doing this.
Now, you've consulted with some police agencies in the past. Do they find these suggestions welcome or unwelcome?
It depends. Outside the United States, there's much more acceptance among police for these ideas. Inside the United States, much less so. But I think that, you know, my experience has been that there are a lot of police, rank and file police and police leaders, who do not want to be in the mental health business, who do not want to be in charge of homelessness, who don't really want to be in schools. And that's a good place to start. Let's get them out of those places and give those problems the kind of attention they really deserve.
So I guess the core question would be, where do we start? When it comes to defunding and restructuring, where do we put the money first?
Well, I think the first thing you need to do is to have a real assessment of the problem at the community level. What are the public safety challenges that these communities face that have been turned over to police to manage? In some communities, it may be about opioid overdoses. In other communities, it might be about youth violence or domestic violence or street robberies. Well, we need to know what those problems are, car break-ins, and then begin to develop specific evidence-based strategies to address those problems in less punitive ways. What I hear frequently across the country, and I go to about 20, 25 cities a year before COVID, is that what the things that you hear to begin this conversation are the things I mentioned before. Get police out of the schools, get them out of the mental health business, quit using them to manage homeless people, and also, you know, rethinking vice and narcotics units. These units are notoriously corrupt, brutal, and ineffective, and divert a huge amount of resources. And we need different strategies for resolving those problems. And it starts just concretely, right? Having those community assessments and then articulating these demands to local officials, to city council members who claim to be our friends, but won't give us the things we need. And if they won't, then we need different city council members.
We have another question. Are there any global models that you'd point to where things are working in this direction, aside from Portugal, which is a great example of decriminalization?
Sure. Well, so throughout Europe, they've never heard of school policing. This is a completely foreign idea to them. When you explain it to them, they think we're crazy. They would never turn the problems of their young people over to armed police to manage. They would put more resources into the schools to get to the bottom of the problem. They would bring in care workers and educators, not armed police. In New Zealand, parts of Australia, parts of Latin America, parts of Nevada, sex work is legal. It's regulated like any other business, and it's taken out of the black market, which means it takes the power away from pimps and customers who would victimize sex workers. It gives them some control over their work lives, their money, and their safety. And in the process, it creates new avenues for economic self-sufficiency for people. And the results in New Zealand have been very positive. They're very happy with it. It's not perfect. None of these examples are perfect. There's no program that we're going to put in place that is going to eliminate all harms. But we have a lot of harms now. And the goal is to have fewer of those harms. One other example, in the UK, they don't use police on mental health crisis calls. If your son or spouse is having a mental health crisis, you call a different phone number that's tied to the National Health Service, and you get a clinical response. And because they have national health insurance, the people responding have access to your medical records, so they know that for the person in crisis, they know, well, what medication are they on? What's the name of their doctor? What's the diagnosis? So that they know what they're getting into when they get there. And because that's the system, the person who's having a crisis knows that whoever's responding is a medical care worker. So there's no such thing as suicide by cop in the United Kingdom, because no one there expects someone with a gun to show up. And so many of the tragedies we've seen in the US is someone who's having a crisis, is suicidal, and knows if they call 911 and they show a gun or even something that looks like a gun, or they pretend is a gun, that there's a good chance that police will come and kill them. And we could just put a stop to that by no longer sending the police.
Professor, to take it back a step regarding the schooling, you know, I think we all know that, you know, the United States has a much higher percentage of school shootings. Do you see the officers, the agencies, the police officers in the schools as a result of that? Do you think that there's another way to, you know, calm the concerns of the family and society and the parents of these children? What are the alternatives for that?
So school shootings is one factor. The other factors has been education reform, in which education was moved to teaching to the test and creating zero tolerance disciplinary systems and cutting out all the extracurricular and enrichment activities, you know, to focus on the essentials. And also just this kind of super predator myth that emerged in the 90s that said, you know, kids were all going to be evil killers. So what about school shootings? What do we do about that? So first of all, armed police have not been a help. There were armed police at Columbine. There were armed police at Parkland. It made no difference. No lives were saved. Almost all of these school shooting cases, someone knew, someone suspected. Often someone called police and said, I'm concerned that this person is going to do something. It didn't help because police don't have the tools to address this. They're not designed to do preventative interventions. I believe it was the Parkland case. People told them this kid has guns, but they have liberal gun laws in Florida, and the police were like, well, there's nothing we can do. Yeah, he's got guns. Everybody's got guns. But if we had a real early warning system that wasn't tied to the criminal justice system, that allowed kids to come forward and say, you know, I think my friend is maybe going to hurt himself or someone else, but I don't want to be the kid who gets my best friend arrested, right? Because once kids think that if they say something, the police are going to get involved, they're not going to say anything. And that's the pattern we've seen. We've got to create an alternative system so there's someone they can go to who's not going to get the police involved as the first approach, who's going to try to intervene in this young person's life in some meaningful way to prevent something horrible from happening. And putting more guns in the schools is going to lead to more accidental shootings, more suicides by gun in the schools, and more use of the guns to you know, deal with domestic disputes and interpersonal disputes. And that's what we've seen. Teachers shooting students accidentally. So we don't need more guns in the school. We need fewer guns in the school, and we need real resources for children.
And Professor, you mentioned a little bit earlier about NHS in Britain. What are your viewpoints on Medicaid expansion and healthcare access?
I think it's essential. I mean, this is not my area of expertise. Should it be single payer? Should it be Medicare for all? Yes, something like that needs to be put in place. This idea of private for-profit health insurance is ridiculous and deeply harmful. We pay more money for less care, and it leads to a worsening of class and race inequality in our society.
And now, what about the argument, just speaking in terms of morality? And we're talking about the legalization of drugs and the sex trade itself. What do you say to those who feel like going down that path as a nation will lead us to sacrifice our moral center?
Great. So I'm very concerned that my kids might smoke tobacco, which is legal, but very harmful. And tobacco directly led to the death of my father, and just something that I would be very upset about. I don't want the government involved. This is between me and my children. And the idea that police are the tool to fix this problem for my family is completely ridiculous. That can only lead to more problems. Yes, we have problems with drugs in our society, and police have not helped at all. Any young person in our society can get any kind of drugs whenever they want them. When I travel around the country, I ask this question of young people all the time. I say, if your grade in this class depended upon whether or not you could get illegal drugs, is there anyone here who would be at risk of failing? And they all laugh, right? Because they all know exactly who they would call. And most of them don't want drugs, not because they're illegal, not because they're concerned about the police, but because they live stable lives where drugs don't seem appealing to them. And that's about what goes on in the home and in the community. And policing just makes that situation worse. So yes, have your concerns about the well-being of young people and take that seriously and get involved in your young people's lives. But turning it over to the police is just going to lead to their criminalization. And we think, oh, it's just the bad kids down the block that are involved with the drugs. Actually, that turns out it's your nephew. It's your grandson. It's everywhere. Quit thinking that putting more people in prison is going to send a moral message that's going to fix this problem. Got one or two more here?
Yeah, I think we've hit most of the questions here. One viewer asked, can you suggest a good review of evidence-based policing practices?
Well, this is a massive literature. So, and it's very disputed. I mean, some of it is done by economists who are correlation shopping. You know, they don't actually know anything about how policing works. They're not familiar with high crime neighborhoods. They get these big data sets with crime data and policing data that is often not accurate, that misunderstands the nature of the problem, and then they keep running regressions until they find a correlation. And then they publish a story that says, see, I found a correlation that shows that if we put 50 more police on a street corner, we get a 2% reduction in robberies. It's not meaningful. It's not helpful. So what we need is more evidence about alternatives to policing. So in my book, there are hundreds of endnotes, reports and studies about what we could do with schools, what we could do about youth violence, what we could do on mental health fronts. And so take a look at that. But the rest of that literature is very complicated, highly disputed, and does not paint a clear picture. There's a lot of contradictory results out there. And ultimately, it doesn't matter if we can show that, yes, if we arrest another 1 million people, we can have some reduction in crime. The whole point is to quit arresting people, to quit relying on that approach. whenever we have an alternative that doesn't tear people down, but builds them up.
Professor, I want to thank you so much. And I think we've hit all the questions that our viewers put up, but I do want to ask you as a final note, if you're able to, you do speak a lot in your book about how I think most people in society think that the purpose of police is to protect people. But in reality, that is such a small part of what police actually do every day. Can you just touch on that?
Sure. I mean, there's a very long answer to that that goes back into this history of why police are created. But really, if we look at what police actually do every day, if you ride around in the back of a police car for a day, and I do this around the country and around the world, what they're doing is they are micromanaging the public behavior of the most vulnerable and marginalized people in our society. They're chasing homeless people out of encampments and off street corners. They're harassing unemployed kids with no access to decent programs, out of parks and off street corners. They're, dealing with folks with mental health crises wandering the streets. And they're criminalizing underground economies that people have turned to out of economic desperation. And most of that, almost all of that, could be dealt with in better ways. And when the police do get involved in that stuff, they don't actually make anyone's life any better. Look at Eric Garner. They spent years harassing him, arresting him, driving him into the criminal justice system because he was selling loose cigarettes on a street corner because he had no other way to make any money. And all those arrests and harassment did not succeed in removing him from the community, certainly didn't make his life any better, didn't connect him to services or employment or alternatives, and ultimately led to his death. And that's what we're up against. That's the problem, right? Instead of putting those officers in jail or tightening up the language on chokeholds, quit using the police for that. Let's actually give the Eric Garners of the world a better way of being, a better chance of being in the world that doesn't, produce harms for people.
Thank you so much, Professor. We went a little over, but I can't tell you how invaluable this was to us, and I know to our viewers. His book, The End of Policing, is, I really can't put into words how informative it was for me. You did such incredible research and information that you put in here. Thank you for publishing this and for writing this. I think I highly recommend anyone to read it. He also has it on audiobook. You can listen to it in the car. It's so informative and really sheds so much light on not just the problems we have now and solutions, but also the history of where our country comes from when it comes to policing. Lots of things that most people don't realize. So I highly suggest you check this out. He has other literature out there. We're gonna put a link to that on our social media pages. And I do want to also, and I apologize, I had forgotten to mention at the beginning, this event was also co-hosted by the College of Charleston's Department of Philosophy and the Department of Sociology and Anthropology, and we thank them for also helping us in co-hosting this event. Dr. Vitale, thank you so much for all that you do. Thank you for taking the time to talk with us and to educate us on the important work that you do. And we hope maybe one day to have you back. And best of luck to you, and I hope you continue to fight the good fight.
I'm missing some Southern cooking, so I'm looking forward to the days when I can get back out on the road and to visit with everybody in person. So you're most welcome.
Anytime, come on over. We got a lot of great cooking over here.
You bet.
Thank you. Hopefully we'll talk soon.
You bet.
Take care, Doctor.
Have a good day, everybody.
You too. Bye.